Greetings, minions, I am your humble narrator, SideWaysThinker, and I'm here with another episode of that there Enigmatic Entity, a series in which I discuss some of the more uncanny video game characters. This week I'm going to be touching on a character connected to the literary universe that gave birth to what we now understand as modern fantasy fiction, Celebrimbor from Shadow of Mordor. Therefore the three remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone, and the hand of Sauron had never touched them, yet they also were subject to the One. From that time, war never ceased between Sauron and the elves, and Eregion was laid waste, and Celebrimbor slain, and the doors of Moria were shut. That's it! That's all there is! That's it! Okay, fine, I'll actually discuss the character. Celebrimbor is an elf in the Lord of the Rings franchise, got his first appearance in J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion. He is a member of the Elven Noldor race and is the son of Curufin, fifth son of Fëanor. As a descendant, indeed the last descendant of the Elven Lord Fëanor, Celebrimbor is related to a great deal of the important events that transpired in the ancient history of Middle-earth. Quick addendum. This is being added to the script after it's been written. Due to Celebrimbor's origins being mostly relating to events from the Silmarillion, a lot of this is going to sound like gibberish even if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, but not the Silmarillion. Hell, I've read the Silmarillion and even I'm having to check everything 3 times. Then check what I corrected 3 times. And then check and correct my correction 3 times again to make sure I understand what I'm writing. Because if I don't and I say someone's left eye was slightly larger than it should be, someone will come to my house and Roger me bloody with an Uruk-hai cleaver. I'd suggest you either watch some Lord of the Rings lore videos or keep the Lord of the Rings wiki handy for this one. Sorry, but if I explain every term I use, we will be here for days. Okay, back on track. For the unaware, Fëanor was the creator of the titular Silmarils, crystals which contained the light of the world before the world was corrupted by the machinations of Morgoth, formerly Melkor, and the spider beast Ungoliant. The light for the crystals came from the 2 trees of Valinor, trees crafted by the gods themselves, and containing a light of absolute purity. These trees were later consumed by the spider beast Ungoliant in a bid to, alongside Morgoth, invade the land of the gods and steal the Silmarils, an effort that succeeded. Fëanor, being flung into a rage over his loss, placed an oath upon himself and each of his children, known as the Oath of Fëanor, which swore them to seek the Silmarils, and ensure that they would remain only in the hands of the House of Fëanor. Those who swore the oath are Fëanor himself, Maedhros, Malgor, Celagorm, Curufin, Amrod, Amras, and the lesser-known and more obscure Noldor elf, Bingley Bongley Boo St. Johnson the 27th, Esquire PhD, but we won't concern ourselves with him. In fact, we won't be concerning ourselves with almost any of the House of Fëanor, as Celebrimbor was one of the few members of the House to remain largely untouched by the Oath of Fëanor and the great tragedies it brought to that family line. So far as I'm aware, Celebrimbor was not involved in any hunt for the Silmarils, and indeed openly disliked the way his kin were behaving with their obsession with the Silmarils. In many ways, in the early days of Middle-earth, the Silmarils caused man and elf to behave similarly to those infatuated with the One Ring in the Third Age. Indeed, there is little to no mention of Celebrimbor in the lore that I could find prior to the release of Shadow of Mordor, aside from what I read out at the beginning of the video, which is something I find rather odd given his connection to a family that is very active in the Silmarillion, and given his actual role in the little lore there is about him. What is known from the books is that he is responsible for the Noldor settling in the region known as Eregion, close to the dwarf-controlled mines of Moria. There, he, and the smithing elves that followed him, settled and worked, and had curiously close relations with the dwarves of Moria. Sometime after their settling, the elves of the Eregion region were approached by a fair-looking creature calling itself Annatar, or the Lord of Gifts. The gift-giver befriended the elves of Eregion, with the exception of Celebrimbor himself, who was deeply distrusting of the Lord of Gifts. Annatar claimed to be a vassal and messenger of the Valar, the gods of Middle-earth, and instructed the elves in the art of crafting rings. Making them openly, they were not aware that they had been somewhat misled by Annatar, and that the process of ring creation he taught placed bindings of magic into each ring. For those of you who haven't worked it out yet, Annatar was the Dark Lord Sauron in disguise, who intended to use the ringcraft of the Eregion elves in his plans for domination of Middle-earth. Indeed, one can assume that the 9 rings granted to the kings of men, who would later become the Nazgul or Ringwraiths, were crafted by these elves, along with the 7 granted to the Dwarf Lords. All of them crafted under the guidance of Sauron, and corrupted in their creation, with the Dark Lord himself later forging the One Ring in secret to control the rest. Celebrimbor himself also learned the art of ring making, but due to his intense and correct distrust of the Lord of Gifts, he crafted his rings in secret, as well as creating the 3 rings that belonged to the elves. These being the Ring of Fire, that was given first to the elf Gil-galad, but ultimately resided with Gandalf, the Ring of Adamant, which belonged to Galadriel, and the Ring of Air, which ended up in the hands of Elrond. As punishment for forging the 3 rings, which Sauron saw as a betrayal, Sauron threw off his disguise as the Lord of Gifts, and elected to go to war, ultimately invading, conquering, and destroying the land of Eregion. The attacks were successful, and Celebrimbor was captured by Sauron. Under torture, Celebrimbor revealed the locations of the 7 and the 9, but not the 3. He died in Sauron's hands, and was paraded as an example to other enemies of the Dark Lord, but Sauron never managed to claim the 3. Ultimately, with Celebrimbor died the line of Fëanor. Of Celebrimbor's personality in the original canon, little is known other than that he was described as being dwarfish of nature in his obsession with great works and crafts. Other than this, he is remembered as being a hero for his efforts to defend Eregion and to thwart Sauron. In the game, Shadow of Mordor, his story is quite different. First of all, he is said to have created all of the rings, from the lesser rings of dwarves and men to the rings of power of the elves, even to the One Ring itself. After his capture by Sauron, he even assists in altering the Ring of Power, inscribing the lettering upon it and granting it its curious amount of individual will and agency. He ultimately ends up going to war with Sauron, using his own ring against him. As is seen in the Bright Lord DLC for Shadow of Mordor, Celebrimbor uses the power of the Wand to create his own Uruk army within Mordor to challenge Sauron. He very nearly succeeds, however the ring's will betrays Celebrimbor, slipping from the elf's finger just before he can kill Sauron and landing onto the Dark Lord's finger. Celebrimbor loses control of his orc army and is captured, tortured, and killed. Rather than a heroic figure, Celebrimbor in Shadow of Mordor is a manipulative and power-hungry beast, clearly influenced and infatuated with the powerful draw of the One Ring, driven as much by revenge for his family and the wrongs done to him as he is by a lust for power.
Mordor will be mine. Behold my monuments of light. My power and grace will wash over this land.
And there we have Celebrimbor. Honestly, I didn't know entirely how much was changed about his character in Shadow of Mordor until I started looking into it. I find it quite interesting how Monolith looked at who was a relatively minor character with precious few mentions in Tolkien's works and made this entire game and story based on it. But they did it, and managed to make it mostly interesting, and even if it's not entirely in keeping with the proper lore, Shadow of Mordor is still a damned fine game, which I deeply enjoy. Anyway, that's going to have to be all from me for now. I've been your humble narrator, SideWaysThinker, and as always, keep calm and carry on. Good day. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that video as much as I enjoyed making it. Well, I say that, I could have been having a really shitty day when I recorded that. You can't tell, and I certainly can't. Pre-recorded message and all that. Anyway, just here to say that I have a Twitter account that you can follow if you want occasional updates of random thoughts from me, and that if you're feeling generous, feel free to donate to my Patreon campaign. Every penny donated there makes life easier for me generally and slowly goes towards me getting a better gaming PC. Well, that's that. It's over. Leave. Now. Now!
Do not seek the SideWaysThinker. Do not seek the Pardoner.